So good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I'm Jennifer Glancy. In my day job, I'm a New Testament scholar, and I'm professor of religious studies at Lemoyne College, where I currently have the fancy title of O'Connell Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Humanities, which is a distinction formerly enjoyed by my steering committee co-chair, Fred Glennon. It's my privilege to introduce today's keynote address by Father Bryan Massingale, professor of theology at Fordham University. And I'm going to do that. No, really, I am. It's been a 4-year planning process. So we started planning this conference in 2013 as things were wrapping up at Creighton University, another great conference. Think back to 2013. We were just beginning Barack Obama's second term as President of the United States. We were confirming our keynote speakers 18 months ago. We did not know who the nominees would be for President of the United States, much less did we know the outcome of that election. And so part of me, as I approach this podium, I have this kind of long perspective. We have some persistent challenges on the justice front. But I also have to say for myself, as I started writing these remarks last weekend, I wasn't really thinking that much that I would be worried today about imminent nuclear war, which, you know, everyone says don't believe the president, it's not really going to happen. But I just also have to take this moment to say that not only do we have to affirm our commitment to work for justice, we also have to be peacemakers and to struggle with the question of what it might mean in all the different ways, from the streets of our cities to the international arena. What does it mean to be a peacemaker in 2017? Well, pray for peace. But on a lighter note, I do have, on a happy note, some words of gratitude. On behalf of the National Steering Committee, I would like to thank our generous hosts at Seattle University. There are many people here whom we could thank, but I have to single out Joe Orlando and Eddie Salazar, with whom I have been in constant contact over these past months, weeks, and days. Also, Also, on behalf of the National Steering Committee, I would like to thank the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities, especially Father Michael Sheeran, Stephanie Russell, and Deanna Howes, who have been gracious in their support of our project. On my own behalf, I would like to recognize the hardworking members of the National Steering Committee that planned this conference. I can't tell you how much I have relied on my co-chair, Fred Glennon, and the other committee members, as time considerations prevent me from telling you about their individual contributions, but I'm so grateful. Roger Bergman, Mary Beth Combs, Mike Duffy, Patrick Gilger, SJ, Heather Mack, Dave McMenamin, Dave Opitz, Joe Orlando, Nicholas Santilli, and Andrea Whistler. I hope that there are a few members of this afternoon's audience so invigorated by the proceedings of the conference that they contact me to talk about contributing to the planning of the next national conference on the commitment to justice and Jesuit higher education, which we hope will take place on some Jesuit campus 4 years from now. Stay tuned. We're working on it. And now to introduce our keynote speaker. I had the privilege of hearing Bryan Massingale speak at Lemoyne in 2015. He delivered one of the best academic addresses I have ever heard, characterized by an original perspective, depth of analysis, and also by a rare clarity that earned him recognition as an outstanding teacher at Marquette University, where he served on the faculty for many years. It was the kind of lecture that pushed me to renew my own commitment to working for racial justice in my teaching, research, and campus service. The recipient of several honorary doctorates, Bryan Massingale has served as convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium and as president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. Along with dozens of articles, chapters, and reviews, he is the author of a 2010 monograph, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. In this work, he attempts to demonstrate, in his words, how a serious reckoning with the African American experience would enable Catholic social ethics to address some of its deficits. In a review symposium in the journal Horizons, one of several review symposia for the volume, Laurie Cassidy writes that Massingale understands justice, quote, not as an abstract concept, but as a visceral desire, passionate dream, and embodied hope, a horizon of possibility that energizes praxis. Massingale proposes that an African American understanding of justice holds enormous potential for all of us in America because it enables us to imagine and enact justice, not simply and abstractly to define it, end quote. Justice as visceral desire, justice as passionate dream, justice as embodied hope. In Jesuit higher education, as in other Jesuit apostolates, the promotion of justice is understood to be an essential element of the service of faith. In the many concurrent sessions of the conference, we explore and celebrate some of the ways that our campuses try to nourish a faith that does justice. In the spirit of the Magis, we also challenge ourselves to do more. I expect that Professor Bryan Massingale's address this afternoon will serve as such a charge to this assembly. Please welcome him to speak about the Ignatian witness to truth in a climate of injustice.
Good afternoon. You can do better. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Yeah, after all, you're supposed to be justice people, right? It means we're supposed to have a passion for this stuff, right? Right? Oh, Lord. All right. It is good to be here with you. And I want to make a couple of notes just to kind of to set the stage here. First of all, the title, The Nation Witness to Truth in a Climate of Injustice, is also the keynote essay for the next issue of Conversations, the magazine about Jesuit higher education. There'll be copies of it out there. 60% of what you're going to hear today is in there. 60%. 40% is not. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Also, I see people with their cell phones. They want to take pictures of the slides. Relax. They are videotaping this, and this is going to be, the slides will be integrated into the frame of all this, so you don't have to scribble down everything, okay? You're like my undergraduate students. It's like, oh, I'm going to miss something. You're going back. Can you go back? No, I'm not going to go back because it's on videotape. Don't worry about it. It's okay. Now, I said 60% is in the Conversations magazine. Because when they approached me and asked me to write the keynote for the Conversations, they said, well, you can kind of anticipate what your talk is going to be and just write that. And I thought, that's a good idea. For once, I'll have the talk done 36 hours before the event, which is really wonderful. Except something happened between the time I submitted the essay and today. And that something that happened is that I turned 60 years old. I know, I look really good for 60. Absolutely. 60 and proud. Now, why am I telling you that? Because with 60, a realization and a grace came to me. The realization when you turn 60 is that you realize that you don't have as much time to come as you did before. And so things that need to be said sooner rather than later. The other thing that happens with 60 is a grace. And that is, having spent most of your life trying to conform to what other people think you should be, you realize, I just want to be myself, finally, and speak what needs to be said. And that's different than when I was in my 20s. When I was 20s, I had those feelings of, I don't give a fudge, or something like that. Except that when you say, I don't give a fudge when you're in your 20s, it's like, I really do, and I want you to love me anyway. And when you're in your 60s, is, I don't give a fudge, and I don't care if you like it or not. Because you realize that time is short, and that there are some truths that need to be spoken. And I say all of that to say that between the time I submitted the Peace and Conversations until now, I realized that we have a terrible lack of truth when it comes to speaking about justice, and a terrible lack of truth when it comes to speaking about race. And so I want to be truthful. I want us to risk honesty. And I offer this contribution in that spirit of saying there are certain things that are urgent. And that urgency calls us beyond our complacency and beyond our comfort. And if we, who in various ways are the promoters of justice in our various institutions, if we're not willing to be stretched beyond our comfort zones, then what hope is there in our various institutions? And so I'm offering this as, if you're saying, oh my God, this is not quite what I wanted, different from Abel this morning, you can blame it on being 60, okay? That's what I'm trying to say. So with all of that then, let's get to work and see what happens here. In an address that he gave to the Rota, which is one of the chief law courts of the Catholic Church, Pope John Paul II quoted a 17th century maxim that truth is the foundation, basis, and mother of justice. Truth is the basis, foundation, and mother of justice. In doing so, the Pope was highlighting the often noted connection between justice and the quest for truth. For example, many truth and reconciliation processes undertaken in the aftermath of severe social traumas, such as in South Africa, Rwanda, and many other places, they have vivid reminders that healing estrangements between peoples and establishing right relationships between social groups can only be premised upon an honest acknowledgement of the harms committed or tolerated against others. Communal and national honesty are effective prerequisites for effective reconciliation and a just society. Now, I'm focusing this contribution to our once every 4-year gathering about justice. We have to do something about that once every 4 years. I'm focusing my contribution on the issue of racial justice for 3 reasons. The first reason is that every significant justice concern that we have, whether it's advocacy for the homeless, or whether it's HIV/AIDS, or LGBTQ rights, or the rights of women, or healthcare, or just education, every social justice concern we have is entangled with or aggravated by racial injustice against persons of color. So if we don't get racial justice right, then the rest of our justice advocacy is ineffective or inadequate. So we've got to go there. The second reason why I go there is not because of my identity, or this is not racial politics. It's because racism is our most enduring justice wound and challenge. By any measure or reckoning, the pursuit of racial justice is still, in Langston Hughes' words, a dream deferred. In a published report in last summer 2016, a United Nations Commission investigating the situation of African Americans in the United States. Did you know they actually paid a site visit to the United States to look at the state of African Americans? No, because it didn't get a whole lot of press. We'll talk about that in a moment. They forthrightly concluded that despite substantial changes since the end of Jim Crow and the fight for civil rights, a systemic ideology of racism ensuring the domination of one group over another continues to negatively impact on the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of African Americans today. Racism is our most enduring justice wound, our most enduring justice concern. And thirdly, I focus this contribution on racial justice because it's the one concern in a Catholic context that we find the hardest to address. I've taken to saying that when we talk about racism, we have to overcome three obstacles. The first obstacle is that we don't know what we're talking about, especially in a post-racial society, so-called post-racial society. We don't know if we're talking about individual prejudice or systemic injustice. We don't know what we're talking about. We don't know how to define racism. The second is we don't know how to talk about it, especially in an interracial context. You know, black people, I know we talk about race among ourselves. I've heard that Latinos talk about race among themselves. I have a good authority that white people talk about race among themselves, except that, I said in good authority, but when we get together, there's a strange kind of civility or code that takes place that says, well, we don't want to go there because we don't want to be considered, impolite or whatever, so we just don't know how to talk about it. But the third obstacle we face is that we don't really want to talk about it. Especially not the core reasons for racial disparities and injustice. We don't really want to talk about it. We don't really want to go there. And partly it's because racism involves dealing with very difficult, strong, and complicated emotions. It is easier on Jesuit campuses to have honest discussions about gender and sexuality than it is about race. I'm not saying that we've got gender figured out on our campuses. We don't. And I'm not saying that we don't have a long way to go about LGBTQ issues either. But issues of race too often leave us uncomfortable, tongue-tied, embarrassed, stammering, and mute, and therefore limping from ineffective response to crisis-motivated engagement. Notice how I said that, crisis-motivated engagement. That we tend to deal with race when there's a crisis that comes up, and then we kind of respond to it, and then we realize, and then 6 months later we wonder why things haven't changed. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Someone wiser than me said the truth will set you free. But when I was taking CPE, that becoming a hospital chaplaincy as part of my seminary education, they had one of those old Argus posters up in the group room, and it had a Raggedy Ann doll going through an old washing machine wringer, and it had the doll halfway through, and it said, "The truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable." The truth will set you free, but talking about race and racism brings up all kinds of complicated emotions and very strong emotions. And when I teach about race and racism about undergraduates, there comes a point where their eyes glaze over, not because the material is too intellectually challenging, but because it's become too emotionally difficult. And so what I do is I say, stop, just tell me, what are you feeling? And we fill the board up with words like these: nervous, defensive, angry, afraid, tense, worried, guilty, confused, helpless, overwhelmed, paralyzed. And you know what I say? If you're feeling these things, it means one thing: it means you're normal. And I say that now because if in any justice concern, it's good to realize that when the resistance you feel and are generated from people isn't just a matter of intellectual disagreement, it's also because of intellectual overload and triggering, and so we have to honor that. Not to be paralyzed by it, but to say, yes, I'm feeling embarrassed and overwhelmed, but now that I have acknowledged it, now let's move on. And so if during the course of the next 40 minutes you're feeling these things, remember, Father Massingale said I was going to feel that way. That's okay. Now I can check back in. Good. All right. Why are we doing all that? Because, of course, we're intellectuals, but we're also human. So that's kind of cool. So the questions I want to explore: what is the challenge of this cultural moment that we're in for Jesuit colleges and universities? How do we understand the pursuit of truth in the quest for justice? And what can or ought the Ignatian contribution be for racial justice, given our mission and values? I want to argue that there is a distinctive contribution that the Ignatian heritage invites us to make, without which our pursuit of racial justice will be ineffective, and without which our institutions will be incredible. That is, lacking in credibility. And I'm going to argue, if they're not true to it, they're also lacking in their way of being. And to be more honest, if we're not about offering what we are as Ignatian witnesses, then our institutions have no reason to exist. Just wait. We're just getting warmed up now, okay? Oh, God, I'm loving this. So, the overview for the tired person, because after all, we're all embodied creatures here, and it's late in the afternoon, and someone wiser than me said that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So, in case you nod off, this is what I want to do. I want to talk about obstacles to racial truth-telling, and the obstacles are these: the ideology of personal responsibility, a willful ignorance of truth, and how white discomfort sets the limits of engagement. Oh, finger popping, I like it, all right. And finally, then conclude with the Ignatian witness to truth and how then a call to move from crisis management to mission integrity. Because I'm tired of being in these situations where we're managing crises. I want us to get to a point where we realize we're doing what we're doing, not because we went to a diversity workshop, so you'll see I have a problem with the word diversity, but to say we're doing what we're doing because this is what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ in the Ignatian heritage. That's what we're trying to do. So that's what I'm all about. Now, yes, go for it. Now, also, note that this is an outline. And you may notice that I'm an African American. Are you noticing that? Good. Now, the reason I mention that is because in my cultural heritage, I am the only, my family, the immediate family, is the only extended Catholics in my family. All the others are Baptists, Assemblies of God, Charismatics, and Pentecostals. That means I have a lot of relatives that, go when the Spirit says go. And, with Catholics, we're like neat and orderly when we follow the book, because we have this thing called the Catechism and then the Sacramentary, the Roman Missal, and things like that. So all of this is here to remind you, in case you doze off, you wake up, you'll see where we're supposed to be. But also, we may depart from the outline like I'm doing now. And that means we're going to have a Pentecostal moment. We're going to let the Holy Spirit move. But then for Catholics, we'll get back on program. And we'll follow the little red dots, just like we follow the little red letters in our rubrics, okay? Something for everybody. So, for those of you who are Myers-Briggs J's, this is your slide. For those of you who are P's, don't worry, your moment will come. Okay. Now, with all of that, 3 obstacles to racial truth-telling. The first is the ideology of personal responsibility. Why is it that so many, especially white Americans, are missing in action in the struggle for racial justice? It's because they don't believe that racism is a pressing issue any longer. And because it's not a pressing issue any longer, if folks aren't making it, it's basically their own damn fault. Now, to help us unpack this, I'm going to use a case study of Marquette University's Mission Week that it was held in February of this year. Every year, Marquette University celebrates Mission Week, in which they celebrate their Ignatian charism and their Jesuit ideals. And this year they invited me to return to Marquette from Fordham. They've never gotten quite over the fact that Fordham stole me. They make it sound like that someone, like Fordham just came and handcuffed me and took me somewhere. No, it's more complicated than that. But anyway, they invited me back for this, and which is fine. And the theme of this year was focused on racial justice, black, white, and the call of the church. A student group on campus used this as the opportunity to invite Ben Shapiro to campus. Ben Shapiro, for those of you who do not know, is a noted young conservative activist. I think it would be more accurate to call him a provocateur. The subject of his lecture was, "Can you handle the truth?" He delivered this address before a packed lecture hall of overwhelmingly white male students. And I decided to attend his speech, which was a different experience for me, but I said, well, since he's going to be here, let's take the opportunity to find out what he has to say. I'm starting with him because once you get past his caustic ad hominem polemics that peppered his address and were painful and angering to listen to, his position can be summarized in the following moves. He says, there was a time when there was institutional racism in the United States, but that was 40 to 50 years ago. Note that he isn't exactly sure when it ended, nor did he give an historical marker for its demise, but he said 40 to 50 years ago. That's an exact quote. Therefore, the time of institutionalized racism, that is, of systemic racial injustice, is no more. Systemic racism is no longer a reality. He acknowledges that there are individual racists. That is, people who do bad things and who discriminate because of racial bias. But society as a whole isn't intentional in putting down people of color or holding people of color back. Therefore, for people of color, it is all up to them, or us. At the core of his argument is a plea for personal responsibility. Life is what you make of it was his constant mantra. I repeat it several times. In fact, he declared that if you follow 3 rules, you're virtually guaranteed to achieve middle-class status. What are these 3 rules? Finish high school, don't have children out of wedlock, and get a job. You follow those 3 rules, you're guaranteed to achieve middle-class success. The fundamental conclusion is that life is now a level playing field for all. It wasn't that way 40 to 50 years ago, but it is now. So if people of color, black people in particular, don't make it, it's mostly their own fault. Left unsaid explicitly, but assumed throughout, is that if you don't get ahead, it's your own fault. And moreover, we as a society, and especially white people, have no obligation to help anyone because we took care of all the systemic obstacles and barriers already. Therefore, left unsaid, but very clearly understood by his audience and by him, if white straight men have a disproportionate share of society's goods and benefits, it's because they've earned them by being more intelligent, virtuous, and responsible than other groups. I dwell on Shapiro's argument and views because he is not an aberration. His presentation of this worldview is maybe an exaggeration of a typical point of view present among many Americans, not only white Americans. You've taught students who have this worldview. You probably have family members who have this worldview. You probably have some close friends who have this worldview, or maybe used to be close friends. His line of thinking explains why many, especially white Christians and Catholics, are so anemic and tepid in their engagement with issues of racial justice. They believe that society is now a level playing field. Therefore, notwithstanding a few bad apples of both races, black failure and racial disparities are due to personal irresponsibility, laziness, and lack of effort. The ideology of personal responsibility. Let's consider a concrete example of how this insistence upon the demise of systemic racism and assumption of personal responsibility plays out. Such thinking explains in great measure the apathy or indifference of white Christians toward police violence and misconduct in our society, especially as these are experienced by communities of color and protested by the movements for Black lives. A recent Public Religion Research Institute report related how over 80% of black Christians believe that police-involved killings of black people are part of a much larger picture of racial injustice. However, that same report noted an almost equal number of white Christians believe the opposite, holding that such deaths are mainly isolated incidents with no connection with one another. 71% of white Catholics hold this view. Indeed, white non-Christians are more likely to see a systemic racial problem than white Christians. Or as a recent article that John Gearing authored in Religion News Service this week says, "What's wrong with white Christians?" And he said, not to be provocative, but to argue there is a real problem here. In other words, white Christians are among the least likely to believe that there is a systemic race-based problem of policing in our country. They admit bad things happen, but these are isolated incidents, the problems of a few renegade individuals, not events that point to deeper systemic faults in the institutions of our society. The majority of white Americans, it would seem, would say that racism is no longer a pressing issue, and if it is an issue, it's because people of color are making it an issue. The first obstacle to racial truth-telling. The second obstacle to racial truth-telling is pervasive, I would even say a willful ignorance, or to use, since I'm an academic, to quote Canadian Jesuit philosopher Bernard Lonergan, a collective flight from understanding. Note how the widespread acceptance of an ideology of personal responsibility, the mentality that it's your own fault, is abetted by a pervasive ignorance of the real history of racial injustices in our country. Recall how Shapiro's first and necessary move was a declaration that systemic institutional racism has been eradicated. African-American religious scholar Eddie Glaude states that willful blindness to our history allows so many to absurdly believe that black social misery is the result of hundreds of thousands of unrelated bad individual decisions by black people across the country. One of the best independent assessments of our lack of accurate knowledge of our nation's racial history comes from that UN report that I cited from last year. It notes that most Americans have not been and are not being taught the true history of the country's complicity with what it calls crimes against humanity. Two of its findings are particularly pertinent. The first is here. In particular, they said, the legacy of colonial history, enslavement, and racial subordination and segregation, racial terrorism, and racial inequality in the United States remains a serious challenge, as there has been no real commitment to reparations and to truth and reconciliation for people of African descent. Contemporary police killings and the trauma they create are reminiscent of the past racial terror of lynching. Impunity for state violence has resulted in the current human rights crisis and must be addressed as a matter of urgency. There has been no real commitment to truth because we don't tell our history. I teach a course entitled Malcolm Martin Baldwin and the Church. It's a wonderful, I love that class. One of the students in the course evaluation, I always asked them to fill out one of those, not the one for this institution, but for me. And I asked, what was the most surprising thing you learned in the course? And she said, the most surprising thing I learned in this course was that police brutality isn't a new issue for black people. I thought that Black Lives Matter just happened like 2 years ago. I didn't realize that they've been dealing with this for a long time. And I said, oh, yeah. Or, in order to teach this, I have to give them the basic course on, Jim Crow and its institutions. I mentioned the word lynching in class, and I got these kind of glazed over expressions, and I asked them, can any of you tell me what a lynching is? And one of the students raised his hand and said, isn't that where someone got beat up real bad? And I said, not quite. So we went to the website Without Sanctuary of lynching photography. And we pulled up slide after slide after slide of people being brutalized, dismembered, burned alive, made into photographs, sent through the US mail. And students sometimes get sick and disgusted. And I said, yeah, that's exactly what you should be feeling. Because if you don't feel that, then you think that all Martin Luther King did was march so people can drink from a drinking fountain or not sit in the back of a bus. But that's not what racism was about. But we can't do that because we're ignorant of our true history, and it's an ignorance which is not accidental. It's an ignorance that is willed. The UN report relates that ignorance of our past compromises our ability to deal with present-day injustices. And so it comes as no surprise that in its recommendations for a more racially just society, they conclude, consistently, the school curriculum in each state should reflect appropriately the history of the transatlantic trade in Africans, enslavement, and segregation. And I know that when I talk this way, the typical response is, but we should get over it, because that was so long ago. But as William Faulkner would say, the past isn't past. The past isn't past. Truth-telling, facing the truth of our tragic past, is an essential part of achieving justice in the present. We'll come back to that. What does that mean for Ignatian witness? But before we get there, and this is the part that's not in the conversations piece, but it's one that it's been disturbing, and this is why I had added to this. As disturbing as all of this is, it doesn't answer the question, why? Why in this particular area are we so paralyzed, ineffective, and mute? Why, with this justice concern, is truth so lacking and so actively avoided? Whenever I talk about race, almost invariably, someone will ask the question, excuse me, how can we talk about race in our parish or in my classroom or on our campus without getting white people uncomfortable? Think about it. It's an interesting question and a revealing question. And my response goes along these lines. I say, it's fascinating to me that the one group that is never allowed to become discomforted or disturbed about race is white people. I'm uncomfortable about race almost daily. And the question glosses over and masks the discomfort, pain, and worse that's experienced by people of color. But why is it that the only people who are not allowed to be upset or uncomfortable or disturbed about race are white people? And I know it when I say that. Please, please, please do not come up to me afterwards and say, but I'm different. Please don't do that. I'm not talking about you as an individual. I'm talking about our society. And I'm also talking about what you experience, many of us, in the classroom when we go there. We're always trying to figure out, how can I do this in a way that, makes people not so uncomfortable about this? And I want to say, well, let's interrogate that, because that tells us something about what's going on about race. It's a very revealing question. The question betrays a fundamental reality in our country. And I'm being honest here because I'm 60 years old. I can finally do it. We will only deal with race in a manner and at a pace that does not offend or disturb white people or make them uncomfortable. It's not that we don't do something or are not willing to do some things, but the measure of the response historically has been the comfort of whites, not the comfort of the white majority, because in many instances, whites are not the majority, but still that comfort level dictates the manner and pace of our engagement. As one author puts it, whites have not had to build a tolerance for racial discomfort, and thus when discomfort arises, as some of you might be experiencing right now, whites typically respond as if something's wrong. They blame the person, negative evaluations there, and they trigger the discomfort. We are willing to go there in our institutions, but only to a point. And then we back off, or we demur, or become mute when people are too uncomfortable. And this has serious ramifications and implications. It means that there are certain things that will never get done, certain conversations that will never be said, certain truths that will never be spoken. It means that we'll keep having the same impasses in our country. limping and having the same half-hearted conversations on our campuses about diversity. Because there's no way to have an honest and effective conversation about racial injustice without making white people uncomfortable, because the reason racism was created was to protect, defend, maintain, justify, and legitimate white advantage, benefit, and privilege. That's the reason why it exists. If it were up to people of color, this would have been over with 100 years ago. Seriously, I'm just being honest here. Stripped to its core, race cannot be addressed by diversity because the problem is not the lack of bodies around a table. The problem of racism stripped to its core is this someone I should care about? And this is why diversity, quote unquote, is such a challenging stumbling block, and why it's inadequate, and why we lump gender and sexual orientation together with race. Because a focus on racial diversity implicitly challenges a system that was made to benefit white people. And that's the truth, and it's the truth that will rarely be spoken. And I prayed over whether I was going to say this in this talk. I really did, because I said, they are not going to get this. They don't want to hear this. And I just said, I'm not going to get up there and say something that's not true. I'm not, because again, truth is the basis, the foundation, and mother of justice. And if we can't speak the truth, then we'll keep limping along to one Ferguson, another Baltimore, and another St. Louis, and another Baton Rouge, and another Minneapolis, and we'll keep limping along and wondering why we keep having explosion after explosion after explosion, because we're not willing to speak the damn truth. Because the truth is that diversity, racism, mask white supremacy. And white supremacy is not a matter of sheeted people waving Confederate flags and burning crosses and all that kind of stuff. It's basically the belief, the worldview that the country, our political institutions, our cultural heritage, our social policies, our public spaces, that they belong to some in a way they don't belong to others. And if those others are present, it's by way of exception or largesse. That's what it's about. That's what it's about. Now let's give a concrete example of one that's rooted in our Ignatian heritage. Let's talk about Georgetown. The Jesuit engagement with the issue of black enslavement at Georgetown is a case study of the ways we engage with race, but only up to a point. In April of this year, a ceremony was conducted at Georgetown at which the Society of Jesus formally apologized for its participation in the enslavement, ownership, sale of 272 African Catholic men, women, and children, fracturing their families in the early to mid 19th century. It was a scandal that was written of as early as 1990 in the authoritative study by Cyprian Davis, A History of Black Catholics in the United States. It was only after a recent report in the New York Times that Georgetown and the Jesuits decided to address the issue publicly. At the service in April, Father Timothy Kaseki, president of the Jesuit Conference in the United States, gave a very moving homily in which he acknowledged that the Society of Jesus, quote, had greatly sinned in our thoughts and in our words, in what we have done and in what we have failed to do, close quote. He continued by relating the terrible truth of this sin, and his words are here. When we remember that together with those 272 souls, we received the same sacraments, read from the same scriptures, said the same prayers, sang the same hymns, and praised the same God, how did we, the Society of Jesus, fail to see us all as one body in Christ? We betrayed the very name of Jesus, for whom our least society is named. I listened to this in my office at Fordham live stream, and I was profoundly moved. It is, in my opinion, the most sincere and forthright acknowledgement and apology that has ever happened on race in the Catholic Church. It is. And yet, even here, there is an evasion, a silence, a way of not getting too uncomfortable. The Jesuits raised the right questions, but didn't answer them. The question was raised, how did we fail to see us all as one body in Christ? And it was never answered. I heard the question, and in my office I was saying, yes, that's the question. But then they left us hanging, because they couldn't go further without making people, white people, really uncomfortable. Because the truth would go somewhere like this. We could not see these black bodies as part of Christ's body because we saw God as white. Because in truth, we Jesuits could not have seen these 272 black men, women, and children as belonging to quite the same faith or church as God as us. Because the logic of white supremacy dictates that public spaces, rituals, churches, and even God belong to white people in a way that they don't belong to other groups. And white supremacy's logic dictates that religion and holiness and faith belong to white people in a way it cannot belong to others. That's the answer to the question that Father Kiseki raised but failed to answer or address. He raised the right question, but chickened out. And I have my notes here. That's an academic term. When it comes to the answer. Because the answer would take them and us into really uncomfortable territory. It shows the white American and Catholic tendency to deal with race, but only in ways that do not overly discomfort, disturb, or implicate white people. And that leaves us, therefore, with shallow responses, superficial engagements, ineffective proposals, and keeps us mired in impasse after impasse after impasse. Please don't misunderstand me. Whenever I talk this way, I once had someone come to me after a talk and said, "You're probably the angriest person I ever met in my life, and, how can you call yourself a Catholic? You don't talk like a Catholic priest." Well, I hope not. Most of them are kind of boring. But anyway, but more honestly, it's this. I have the word FR in front of my name, and I'm proud to say I've been a Catholic priest now for 34 years. Okay, I was supposed to be the first of my ordination class to leave. They didn't think I'd last this long. It goes to show. Anyway, I say these things not as someone who enjoys beating up on people or beating up on the Catholic Church. I rather say these things as someone whose heart is continually broken by my church's failure to live up to its own profession and creed. I say these things not in order for us to be on a downer, I'm saying these things because there is something fundamental at stake here, and what's at stake is our integrity. And our integrity as Christians and as believers, as people who are committed to the Ignatian ideal, that integrity has to matter more than our racial comfort or our racial identities. And if it doesn't, then we're wasting our time and we're saying something that's fundamentally untrue. And so I want us to go there. I want us to be uncomfortable. I want our hearts to break. Because as we'll see later on, when our hearts are broken, it's only then that they can be filled with something that's much bigger and greater than we are. Which leads us to the point you've really all been waiting for. The Ignatian witness for truth. Whew. What does the integrity to our mission call us to? And what does it mean if we move from crisis management, limping from crisis to crisis to crisis, to responding out of the integrity of our mission? If truth is the basis, foundation, and mother of justice, what are the challenges and opportunities of the state of affairs for Jesuit higher education in the United States? What does it mean for our Jesuit campuses to be sanctuaries of truth in the midst of so much injustice and denial, so much willful ignorance and calculated evasion? Several things. First, commitment to Ignatian witness to truth requires that our institutions recommit themselves to a faith that does justice. One of the lasting memories, not only did I teach at Marquette for many years, I'm actually an alum of Marquette. I went there for 4 years and I got my BA from there. It was a really cool place to be there. One of my lasting memories of my undergraduate theology courses at Marquette was studying the book, The Faith That Does Justice. It was a compilation of articles written by Jesuits in the mid-1970s, reflecting how the promotion of justice was an essential part of Christian faith. I don't remember the specifics of the articles, and I try to remember them when I teach my students, and they're not going to remember most of what I teach them right now. And it's very humbling as a teacher, but I try to accept it. But the title of the book arrested me and inspires me still. It was the first time that an explicit connection was made between my belief in God and my hunger for justice. And I then discovered that this deep connection is a fundamental Jesuit conviction. It was first articulated in 1975 during its 32nd General Congregation, and then it's been reaffirmed repeatedly since, and most notably for us, at the first Justice Convocation in 2000 at Santa Clara University by the then Father General Peter Kallenbach. And his words are powerful and prophetic. He said, "Since St. Ignatius wanted love to be expressed not only in words but also in deeds, the congregation committed the society to the promotion of justice as a concrete, radical, but proportionate response to an unjustly suffering world." He continued, "Fostering the virtue of justice in people was not enough. Only a substantive justice can bring about the kinds of structural and attitudinal changes that are needed to uproot those sinful, oppressive injustices that are a scandal against humanity and God." Radical responses to unjust suffering. That's the end or goal of Jesuit education, not diversity. Diversity is a strategy, a means to an end. Diversity is the way we address unjust suffering. And if that doesn't work, then call it something else. But we're not gathered here because we're advocates for diversity. We're here because most of us, all of us, I dare say, are here because we are so uncomfortable with the world as it is, and we're uncomfortable precisely because of our faith, however we articulate that faith. And that's the faith that does justice as a concrete response to unjust suffering. A commitment that needs to be not rhetorical, but effective. Kaltenbach's challenge raises some questions, and that is, has this challenge been truly received by our Jesuit campuses and universities? Truly, has it been? Or as I often say, do we believe our own stuff? I'm using stuff because it's a word I can't say the other word. Do we believe our own stuff? Do we see ourselves as the sacred custodians of a holy trust? That the service of faith for the promotion of justice has been entrusted to our care? How do our campuses continue to inspire new generations of young people, captivating them with book titles and courses and experiences and witnesses that show them the deep connection between love of God and justice for their neighbors? To put this more negatively, if in the midst of a society scarred by racial injustices, Jesuit colleges and universities are not forthright witnesses of concrete, radical responses to unjust suffering, then we fail to embody what makes us unique among institutions of higher education. And if we are no different than any other college or university, especially our lower cost competitors who can offer just as valuable an educational product at a lot less money, then we have no reason to survive. And most likely we won't. The Ignatian Witness for Justice, the second thing, it means accepting that we have much to unlearn. Malcolm X, you don't hear him quoted too often in Catholic talks, once said, untruths have to be untold. We have to be untaught before we can be taught. And once untaught, we can unteach others. He thus stated his belief that injustice in America is sustained by a not accidental strategy of miseducation and omission. The bottom line is that most of us have been taught many untruths or half-truths about our nation's dealing with race and communities of color. If truth is the basis, foundation, and mother of justice, then an important contribution of Jesuit higher education is fostering a deeper and truer knowledge of this nation's legacy of racial animus and privilege. Our curricula should ensure that no one graduates from our institutions without a sustained engagement with the reality of racial injustice. This is not racial pleading. This, again, is saying if every justice concern is entangled with or exacerbated by injustice against persons of color, then if we don't do this, something's profoundly missing. Or to put it another way, if our institutions exist to promote and disseminate knowledge, how can they do that if they don't respect the intellectual contributions of the majority of the human family? Fourthly, we need to be honest. This is the truth and advertising part of it. Racial solidarity implies conflict. I teach courses that focus on race and white supremacy and religious complicity, and the students are often bewildered, confused, and dismayed as they encounter new knowledge, question previously held beliefs, and face the uncomfortable truth that religious leaders have not always been agents of justice. Sometimes they express their discomfort in less than mature ways. That's an understatement. And as this winter's controversy at Marquette demonstrated, fostering honest engagement with racial privilege generates intense and often passionate resistance. Radical responses to unjust suffering, which Kaltenbach said is a core component of Jesuit higher education, will generate not only sincere disagreements and honest misunderstandings, they will also generate vicious and polemical counterattacks. As Jesus would say if he were rewriting the Beatitudes, blessed are you when they blog about you. The road to a just society must go through the path of social conflict. Yes, there is a cost. But as I've learned, no matter what I say, I'm going to catch some hell from somebody. And so if I'm going to catch hell, I'm going to want it to be for something I believe rather than for something I'm saying because I think that's what people want to hear. Now, this puts a point for Jesuit institutions. Institutions, their administrators and boards of trustees, because of their instincts for self-preservation, are inherently conflict and risk adverse. Did I say that? Yes. Are inherently conflict and risk adverse. Yet, the unique nature of institutions founded on an Ignatian charism demand a different and even a counterintuitive approach. There is no other way we can be faithful to our mission of truth in the midst of social injustice. To paraphrase the insight of Martin Luther King Jr., the ultimate measure of our institutional integrity is not where we stand in moments of convenience and comfort, but where and how we stand in times of challenge and controversy. Anyone can be an ally when it's easy. The ultimate measure of an ally, whether it's in gender, LGBTQ, or race, is where and how do we stand when the crap is flying. And this has implications for how do we do board selection and formation. Because this is a serious issue. Because I sit on many different boards of faith-based organizations, and one of the things I had to tell people is that as board members, we have a fiduciary responsibility for the institution, yes. However, we are also custodians of mission. We have a responsibility for the mission of the institution. And I don't know if we've done a very good job of helping our board, who are formed in very different environments, get that they are custodians of a charism. It also has implications for how do we form our presidents of our institutions. Because it's one thing for me to talk to you guys out here because most of you get it. You may not like everything you've heard, but you get it. But we also know that if the president of the institution doesn't get it and doesn't convey to everyone else that he gets it, then sooner or later other people say, I get a pass on this. Racial solidarity implies conflict, and it means you have to be willing to take some crap. If you don't believe me, Google me, okay? There is no risk-free way of being a justice advocate. And that leads us to this. Being an Ignatian witness to truth requires us being beacons of hope and soul transformation. A climate witnessing truth in a climate of injustice will generate obstacles and resistance. And yet, being a person of hope is consistent in the spirit of the exercises. I know we talk a lot about the exercises in Ignatian circles. In the exercises, those who engage them move from a contemplation of the suffering of Jesus to an encounter with the risen Christ. But the resurrection is not an escape from conflict. The resurrection in the spirit of the exercises calls you to engage with conflictual reality in light of a new experience, and that experience is the experience of being loved beyond death. And that experience of being loved beyond death fills you with the courage to struggle for a justice based on truth. A justice that you engage in the fight, and in the words of Ignatius, not counting the cost. And you can only do that because by the end of the exercises, you realize, I'm a sinner, but God loves me, and God loves me beyond death, and that gives me the courage then to take the risk. And as I teach my students about justice, I realize the one thing I have to give my students in my courses on justice, I have to give them hope. But not the facile American kind of hope. The facile kind of hope that says that good always triumphs over evil, and sooner rather than later. The good guys don't always win. That's the American narrative. But this hope, in a perspective of faith, in an Ignatian perspective, is the conviction that though good may not always win, it will ultimately win, even if at a terrible price and sacrifice. But in the Ignatian charism, that sacrifice is worth it because you realize that the passion didn't stop but continued into resurrection. And that gives us the hope that our struggle is worth it despite the obstacles and despite the fact we don't always win. Or in the words of the African-American Catholic worker, Arthur Jones, he says, when you work for justice, you don't always lose. I like that. But there's more to be said. And this is the part that's not in the essay because it came to me afterwards, so I'm haunted by this. I've been haunted by an insight attributed to Albert Einstein, who declared, the world we have created is a product of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. If we want to change the world, we have to change our thinking. No problem can be solved from the same consciousness that created it. We must learn to see the world anew. No problem can be solved at the level of consciousness that created it. And this is where Jesuit education and pedagogy has a role to play and an important contribution to make. If we're going to address racial justice more effectively, we need a transformation, even an evolution of consciousness. For Ignatian pedagogy is not just about the acquisition of knowledge and skills. Ignatian pedagogy, at its core, is about transforming consciousness, transforming the way we think, the way we live, the way we love, the way we move and have our being in the world. That's what Ignatian pedagogy is all about, transforming and creating new human beings. So I'm not going to end this talk by offering a 5-point strategic plan for racial diversity. Why? Because our institutions have far too many of those floating around already. We don't need more plans, we need more implementation. But we won't get implementation unless we change our consciousness, unless we do some personal and corporate soul work. And this is where the Magis comes in. The more I sit with Magis, I am convinced that this is the most dangerous and awesome word in the Ignatian spiritual heritage. It is more dangerous than men and women for and with others. We all got that down, right? Or cura personalis. We all got that down, right? It makes it feel good. Oh, I'm caring for other people. Isn't it great? Magis is scary. Because Magis says that no matter what, there's always more that's out there. And Magis, to me, I don't know, I'm not a Jesuit, so obviously I'm willing to be corrected. But when I think of Magis, I define it as that sacred, holy restlessness that leaves us dissatisfied and longing for that which lies beyond us. The Magis breaks our hearts. The Magis, the quest for more, hollows us. It guts us so that we can be filled and open to more. The Magis opens us up to the divine, the sacred, the holy, however you conceive of God. It opens us up to the God that comes from the future, and that God that calls us to be co-creators of a new creation, of new ways of living and loving and being human. And that's what Ignatian pedagogy is all about. It's this longing for the new. That when we're confronted with these impasses and there's something that leaves us restless and says there's got to be more. And the Magis calls us to find ways of instilling in our students that longing for more. That holy restlessness that leaves us dissatisfied and says that the way things are is not the way they have to be. And that leads then not to a 5-point strategic plan. It leads us to the consciousness that gives us the visceral energy to make the plan real. I know I'm being terribly not concrete about that, but I'm convinced that this is what makes us different. If we want to make our distinctive contribution, then we have to address the soul. And if Jesuit Ignatian institutions of higher education don't have the courage to address soul issues, then what's the point? Then if we're not who we say we are, if we don't believe in our ideals, we're not worth 45,000 plus. So let me say this, and then I'll sit down and shut up. This is what I believe. Jesuit education should lead us to examine truth, to face truth, to embrace truth. If race and white supremacy are based on lies and deceit, illusion and delusion, then Jesuit education liberates us for a transformed consciousness by an impassioned, wholehearted pursuit of truth. The truth that is the basis of justice, the truth that sets us free. I usually conclude my talk by giving you the last words of my book on racial justice, so in case you don't read it to the end, this is it. Words of hope and challenge. Social life is made by human beings. The society we live in is the result of human choices and decisions. This means that human beings can change things. What humans break, divide, and separate, we can, with God's help, also heal, unite, and restore. What is now does not have to be. Therein lies the hope and the challenge. I thank you.